Here we have the conclusion of chapter 2. But if these friends partook of the partisan sternness, they partook also of their steady stuff and their devotion to principle regardless of consequence. A few years after John Payne's coming to Pennsylvania, he was called to share the obloquy incurred by the sect and state of his adoption through their determined and outspoken opposition to slavery. The hardest part of the trial to this loyal son of Virginia was that the abuse came from his beloved South. The trouble grew out of memorials on the subject of slavery addressed to Congress by the Friends meetings and the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion of the Abolition of Slavery. One of these memorials set forth that the petitioners earnestly entreat our attention to the subject of slavery, that you will be pleased to countenance the restoration of liberty to these unhappy men, who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage. And you will step to the very verge of the power vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. The answer to this memorial, the natural and inevitable answer in the heated state of the public mind not yet quieted from the fear of the rupture of the Constitution, was an attack upon the memorialists. What right have the Quakers, it was asked, having refused to risk their lives or fortunes on the conflict, to seek to impress their views upon the government? The Bible, which they interpreted so liberally, was metaphorically hurled at their heads, and finally it was declared on behalf of the South that the Confederation was a compromise wherein each took the other with its bad habits and respective evils for better or worse. The northern states adopting the South with its slaves, and the South accepting the North with its Quakers. Such truants as these might well cut John Payne's heart, still loyal to Virginia as it was, but his mind was already beginning to be bowed beneath a weight of more personal trouble. The setting free of his slaves had seriously diminished his property, and the increased expenses of town life with the old habits of plantation hospitality provided a great drain upon his depleted purse. Philadelphia was spoken of at this time as a place of crucifying expenses. The foreign traveler pronounced the necessities of life there far dearer than in Europe. The rent of a modest house was $300 a year. The wages of a servant rose from $10 to $12 a month, a great sum in those days, yet not sufficient to secure good service, as we may infer from the constant complaints which fill the letters of the mistresses. Elizabeth Drinker, for instance, records one failure after another, but at length appears to think she has found quite a treasure, despite a trifling drawback. Polly Nugent, she says, was this afternoon bound to us by her mother. She has been with us a week and appears clever, brought the itch with her, which I hope we have nearly cured. With costly and ineffective service, with beef at 13 pence the pound, fowls $1 a pair, and other viands in proportion, the expenses of John Payne's family proved far heavier than he had foreseen, and the depreciation of the currency at the same time contributed to cut down his income. In an unlucky hour, he determined to go into business, taking with him his son, John, as a partner. It was easy to foresee the result of such a move on the part of a middle-aged planter without business training. He failed, and his failure signed his death warrant. But the gloom of his last years knew at last one gleam of brightness, and that was in the marriage of his daughter Dolly to John Todd, Jr., a member, like himself, of the Society of Friends, a young man of sterling character and not destitute of this world's goods. Dolly, at this time of her marriage, if we rightly reckon the date of her birth, was 21, and her husband 5 years older. He was the third of his name, grandfather John Todd of New London Township, Chester County, having married Martha Wilson, and her son, his father, having married Mary Durbarrow, and settled in Philadelphia, where the young John Todd was born on the 17th of November, 1763. He was, therefore, 27 when they were married in 1790. The wooing of these young folks has faded into the shadowy past and left no record by which we can trace the secrets of the maiden's heart. Did she love him? Or was the marriage made in obedience to the will of her father, who saw a providence in this offering coming from a man who had already won his confidence and respect? Tradition says that Dolly's first answer was that she never meant to marry, but this may have indicated much or little as we translate it. It seems an undoubted fact that marriage in the early times was more an affair of business than with our generation. In those days, a man, having come of age and accumulated or inherited a sufficient amount of property for comfortable living, began to look about for a wife. Some years later, Mrs. Madison herself wrote to Governor Coles about his wish to secure a wife, in much the same tone she would have used had he been in search of a housekeeper. She fears that whilst they deliberate, the finest girls will be chosen by some brisker suitor, goes on to enumerate the damsels who were already selected, and ends by wishing him a success proportionate to his merits and long search. Probably, however, at the age of 20, Dolly Payne's views on the subject of matrimony were of a more romantic cast than in those early years when she had seen more of the world. Perhaps, too, she already had begun to chafe under Quaker restrictions, and her gay, pleasure-loving nature hesitated to subdue itself for life to a drab-colored existence. Yet when the matter was settled and the marriage definitely arranged, she seems to have accepted the situation cheerfully enough. At the close of the year 1789, she passed the first meeting, a somewhat formidable ceremony in which the Quaker maiden announced that she proposed taking John Todd in marriage and hereby offered her decision for the approbation of friends. After this, the bride-elect was obliged to pass yet another meeting, declaring that her intention still continued the same, and then, no objection being offered, the arrangements for the marriage were concluded. The wedding was solemnized in the Friends Meeting House on Pine Street on the 7th day of first month, 1790, when January whitened the earth with a bridal veil of snow. But Dolly Payne wore no veil of lace or tulle, like Bayard Taylor's Quaker bride. Her wedding gown was ashen silk, too simple for her taste. She wanted lace about the neck and a ribbon at the waist. It is hard to resist a feeling of pity for this young girl who, fond of everything gay and brilliant, compelled to forego the dancing and wine drinking, the stealing of slippers and mischievous merrymaking which marked wedding festivities among the world's people, for the decorum and solemnity of the Quaker marriage in the bare-walled meeting house, where neither priest nor choir, this man and maid stood up together upon the women's side, and declared before God and in the assembled society their intention to taking each other as husband and wife. After the simple Quaker fashion, the groom repeated the formula, I, John Todd, do take thee, Dorothea Payne, to be my wedded wife, and promise through divine assistance to be unto thee a loving husband until separated by death. The bride, in fainter tones, echoed the vow, and then the certificate of marriage was read and the register signed by a number of witnesses, including John, James, Mary, and Alice Todd, relatives of the bridegroom, John and Mary Payne, the bride's father and mother, together with her sisters Lucy, Anna, and Mary Payne, and 60 others. It was the custom for all who signed the marriage register to be entertained later at dinner and afterward at supper at the house of the bride's parents, and we may be sure that John Payne and his wife, who had brought their Virginia notions of hospitality with them to Philadelphia, did not fail to set a bountiful feast in honor of their daughter's wedding.